You are nothing. You have always been nothing, and you will die nothing." The words hit Lyra like stones thrown at glass, each syllable designed to shatter what little remained of her already broken spirit. She felt them settle into her bones, adding their weight to the collection of cruelties she had been carrying for as long as she could remember. Serena stood above her, golden hair catching the early morning light that filtered through the sacred grove's canopy. Her perfect lips curved in the kind of smile that spoke of absolute certainty in her own superiority. Lyra kept her head down and continued scrubbing the ancient stones that formed the ceremonial circle. Her hands were already raw from the harsh soap and cold water, but she knew better than to show weakness. Showing weakness only made it worse. The brush moved in steady circles across the carved symbols that had been worn smooth by centuries of similar preparations, each stroke a meditation in survival. "Did you hear me, servant?" Serena's voice carried that particular edge that meant she was performing for the small audience of beta females who always surrounded her like eager satellites orbiting a cruel sun. "Yes, Beta Serena." Lyra's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, but it was enough. It was always enough to acknowledge the hierarchy, to confirm her place at the very bottom of it, to remind everyone present that she understood exactly what she was worth. The sacred grove hummed with preparation energy as dozens of pack members moved through their assigned tasks. Tonight was the choosing, the ceremony that happened once every generation, when the ancient beast would select the pack's new spiritual guardian. The massive ethereal wolf had not been seen for 23 years, not since it had chosen the previous guardian who had died in the war with the Eastern Packs. Now it would return, and everyone knew who it would choose. Alpha King Thane would be selected, of course. He was everything the beast could want in a guardian, powerful, commanding, born of the purest bloodline the pack had ever produced. At 28, he had already proven himself in combat against 3 rival packs and had expanded their territory to twice its previous size. The choosing ceremony was really just a formality, a beautiful ritual to confirm what everyone already knew to be true. Lyra had been scrubbing ceremonial stones since before dawn, working her way around the perfect circle while the important pack members slept in preparation for their grand day. She would not be attending the actual ceremony, of course. Servants watched from the shadows at the grove's edge, invisible as always, present only to clean up afterward and ensure the sacred space returned to its pristine state. "Make sure you get the bloodstains out of the stones from the last ceremony," one of Serena's companions said, with a laugh that held sharp edges. "We wouldn't want the ancient beast to smell failure when it arrives." Serena's smile widened. Though I suppose it would be fitting, the scent of worthlessness welcoming our future king's triumph. Lyra scrubbed harder, focusing on the rhythm of the brush against stone, the way the symbols seemed to pulse beneath her touch as if responding to something she could not name. She had been doing this work for 15 years, ever since her parents had died in the Eastern War and she had been assigned to the servant class. 15 years of invisibility, of learning that the best way to survive was to become so unremarkable that people forgot you were even there. The morning wore on. Pack members began arriving in their ceremonial garb, rich fabrics and gleaming ornaments that caught the dappled sunlight. Lyra moved her supplies to the grove's outer edge, making herself small and unnoticed as the space filled with anticipation. She found her assigned spot behind a massive oak tree where she could observe without being seen. Alpha King Thane arrived as the sun reached its zenith, and even from her hidden position, Lyra felt the wave of power that preceded him. He moved through the crowd like a force of nature, pack members stepping aside with automatic deference. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, giving him a wild edge that somehow made his authority more absolute rather than less. When he smiled, which he did often as pack members offered their congratulations on his upcoming selection, it was the kind of expression that could start wars or end them depending on his mood. The ceremony began with the traditional invocations, words in the old language that Lyra did not understand but felt in her chest like distant thunder. The pack formed concentric circles around the ceremonial stones she had spent the morning cleaning, their voices joining in harmonies that seemed to make the very air shimmer with expectation. Then the temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. The ancient beast materialized at the grove's heart like moonlight given form and fury. It was larger than Lyra had imagined from the stories, easily the size of a full-grown horse, but built with the elegant lethality of a predator that had never known defeat. Its fur seemed to shift between silver and white depending on the angle of the light, and its eyes were the deep blue of winter ice, with something that might have been stars burning in their depths. The pack fell silent as death. The beast moved with deliberate grace, each step seeming to resonate through the earth itself. It approached Alpha King Thane, who stood straight and proud in the circle's centre, ready to receive the honour that was rightfully his. But the ancient beast stopped 3 feet away from him and turned its massive head, those impossible eyes scanning the assembled pack with an intelligence that seemed older than the forest itself. Lyra pressed herself closer to the oak tree, every instinct screaming at her to become smaller, more invisible, to disappear entirely rather than risk drawing the attention of something so fundamentally beyond her understanding. The beast's gaze swept past the inner circle of elite pack members, past the middle ranks of warriors and artisans, past even the outer ring of lesser wolves. It moved with inexorable purpose toward the tree line where the servants waited in practiced invisibility, where it stopped, and looked directly at her. Lyra felt the breath leave her body as those ancient eyes met hers across the sacred grove. She could not move, could not think, could barely remember how to exist under the weight of that cosmic attention. The beast's head tilted slightly, as if it were studying her, trying to solve a puzzle that only it could see. Then it began to walk toward her. Not a soul moved. Not a whisper disturbed the absolute silence that had fallen over the ceremony. The most powerful supernatural entity any of them had ever encountered was abandoning the Alpha King to pad with earth-shaking steps toward a servant girl who was supposed to be invisible. Lyra tried to run, but her body would not obey her. She was frozen in place, watching her own death approach in the form of beauty so terrible it made her want to weep. The beast stopped directly in front of her hiding place, its breath misting in the suddenly frigid air, and slowly, deliberately lowered its massive head until they were eye to eye. "Impossible," someone whispered from the ceremonial circle, the word carrying clearly in the unnatural quiet. The ancient beast's eyes held hers for what felt like an eternity, and in their depths she saw something that made no sense at all. Recognition, as if it were seeing not the worthless servant girl that everyone knew her to be, but someone else entirely. Someone who mattered, someone who had always mattered. And in that moment, with the most powerful creature in their world looking at her as if she were the answer to a question it had been asking for centuries, Lyra began to understand that everything she had been told about herself might have been a lie. The coronation ceremony took place 7 days after the trial by combat, when the moon was full and the ancient grove hummed with supernatural energy that made the very air shimmer like liquid starlight. The entire pack had spent the week in preparation, transforming their territory from a simple compound into something worthy of hosting the return of Northern Territory's royalty. Lyra stood before the sacred altar where the ancient beast had first recognized her, wearing ceremonial robes that had belonged to queens dead for generations. The fabric was silver silk that seemed to capture and reflect moonlight, embroidered with symbols of power that glowed with their own inner fire. Upon her head rested the crown of the Northern Territories, recovered from hidden vaults where it had waited 23 years for its rightful owner to reclaim it. The crown was a masterpiece of ancient craftsmanship, wrought from silver mined in the deepest caves of their ancestral mountains and set with stones that held the captured light of long-dead stars. It was beautiful, terrible, and so heavy with the weight of generations that wearing it felt like carrying the hopes and dreams of every royal who had come before. Elder Moira stood beside the altar, her ancient voice carrying clearly over the assembled pack as she spoke words in the old language that had not been heard in their territory for more than 2 decades. The ritual was older than written history, a ceremony that connected new rulers to the unbroken chain of sovereignty stretching back to the first wolf queens who had claimed these lands when the world was young. By blood and bone, by fang and fury, by the ancient compact between mortal wolves and the powers that rule the spaces between stars, Moira intoned, her words seeming to resonate through dimensions beyond the merely physical. I present to you Lyra Blackthorn, rightful heir to the silver throne, chosen of the ancient beast, proven in combat, accepted by her people. The pack's response was a howl that rose to the star-filled sky, hundreds of voices joining in harmony that spoke of acceptance and joy and relief that their long exile from true leadership was finally at an end. The sound echoed through the forest, carrying across territories that had once bowed to Northern Territory's rule, announcing to anyone with ears to hear that the lost bloodline had returned. But the coronation was only the beginning. True queenship, Lyra had learned during the week of preparation, was not claimed through ceremony alone. It was earned through the daily choices that shaped a territory's future, through the wisdom to know when to show strength and when to extend mercy, through the courage to make decisions that would affect generations yet unborn. Her first act as queen was to restructure the pack's hierarchy entirely. The old ways served their purpose, she announced to the assembled crowd, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made even the strongest alphas want to listen. But they also created the conditions that allowed corruption and conspiracy to flourish. A system that judges worth by birth alone is a system that wastes the talents of those born to different circumstances. She gestured to Elena, the young warrior who had nearly died during the rogue attack, the girl whose courage in the face of overwhelming odds had triggered Lyra's own awakening. From this day forward, advancement in our territory will be earned through merit, loyalty, and service to the pack's greater good. Birth may open doors, but it will not be the only key that unlocks opportunity. The announcement sent ripples of excitement through the crowd. Servants who had never dreamed of rising above their station looked up with new hope in their eyes. Warriors who had been born to lesser bloodlines stood straighter, recognizing that their path to leadership was no longer barred by circumstances beyond their control. But perhaps the most significant change came when Thane stepped forward to join her before the altar. He wore ceremonial robes that matched her own, silver fabric marking him as her equal partner rather than her superior. When he knelt briefly before rising to stand beside her, the gesture acknowledged something that had never been formally recognized in pack law before. They would rule together, not as king and queen consort, not as dominant and submissive partners, but as true equals sharing power and responsibility in perfect balance. The mate bond, Lyra said, her hand finding Thane's as naturally as breathing, is not a chain that binds one partner to serve the other. It is a connection that makes both stronger, wiser, more complete than either could be alone. Elder Moira stepped forward with the final element of the ceremony, a golden circlet that had been forged specifically for this moment. It was smaller than Lyra's crown, but no less beautiful, set with stones that caught and reflected the silver radiance of her own. By ancient right and new recognition, Moira announced, I crown Thane Shadowmere not as Alpha King ruling over a queen consort, but as king consort ruling beside his equal, sharing power as partners share hearts. The circlet settled onto Thane's head as if it had been made for him, which in many ways it had been. The golden metal complemented the silver of Lyra's crown, creating a visual representation of the balance they would bring to their territory's leadership. When the formal ceremonies concluded, when the last ritual words had been spoken and the final symbols of authority had been bestowed, Lyra found herself standing on the pack house's highest balcony with her mate and partner, looking out over lands that were now truly theirs to protect and guide. The view was breathtaking. Moonlight silvered the forest canopy, revealing the extent of their territory in all its wild beauty. To the north lay the mountains where her bloodline had originated, their peaks touched with snow that gleamed like scattered diamonds. To the east stretched the plains where their people hunted and ran free under star-filled skies. It was all theirs now, all their responsibility, all their privilege, all their burden to bear with wisdom and grace. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the ancient beast had chosen differently?" Thane asked, his arms sliding around her waist as they stood together in the crisp night air. Lyra considered the question, thinking of all the paths that had led them to this moment. The years of servitude that had taught her humility and compassion, the persecution that had shown her the cost of unchecked power, the fear that had made her value safety and peace above personal glory. "I think it chose exactly as it was meant to," she said finally. "The servant girl who scrubbed floors learned lessons that the privileged princess never would have. I needed to understand powerlessness before I could wield power responsibly." She leaned into his warmth, marvelling at how perfectly they fit together despite the impossible odds that had brought them to this point. "And you needed to see past bloodlines and social barriers to recognize worth where others saw only worthlessness." "The mate bond knew," Thane said softly, his lips brushing against her hair. "From the moment the beast made its choice, my wolf recognized what my mind needed time to accept. You were always meant to be here, beside me, ruling our people with the kind of wisdom that comes from understanding both strength and weakness." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with the night sounds of their territory, settling into peaceful sleep. Somewhere in the forest, wolves were running pack hunt patterns that had remained unchanged for generations. In the compound below, their people were celebrating the coronation with feasts and songs that would continue until dawn. All was well in their domain. All was as it should be. "There is one more thing," Lyra said, her hand moving to rest against her still flat stomach. "Something I've been waiting to share until the ceremonies were complete." Thane went very still beside her, his enhanced senses no doubt picking up the subtle changes in her scent that had become apparent over the past few days. When he looked at her, his eyes held wonder and joy and a protectiveness so fierce it took her breath away. "An heir," he breathed, the words carrying all the weight of hope and future that such an announcement represented. An heir," she confirmed, smiling at the expression of absolute happiness that transformed his features. "Our bloodlines combined, carrying both our strengths into the next generation." He kissed her then, soft and reverent and full of promises that stretched beyond their own lifetimes into a future where their children would rule with the wisdom of both their lineages. When they finally parted, she could see tears of joy gleaming in his eyes. "The Northern Territories will have a prince or princess," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child will grow up knowing their worth, understanding their power, prepared to lead with both strength and compassion." "They will," Lyra agreed, her own eyes bright with happy tears. "And they will know the story of how their parents found each other against impossible odds, how love conquered hierarchy, how the servant became queen and the king learned to see past the barriers that blind lesser hearts." The future stretched before them, bright with possibility and rich with promise. There would be challenges, certainly. Other territories to negotiate with, internal conflicts to resolve, the endless work of governing a people who deserved wise and caring leadership. But they would face it all together, bound by love, and strengthened by the certainty that they had found their perfect match in each other. The ancient beast's choosing had seemed impossible when it happened, but standing here in the moonlight with her crown upon her head and her mate's child growing beneath her heart, Lyra understood that it had been inevitable all along. Some loves were written in the stars, some destinies were too powerful to be denied by mortal expectations or social conventions, and some servant girls were always meant to be queens. 3 months into her reign, Lyra stood in the same underground archives where Elder Moira had first revealed her true identity. But this time she was not seeking answers about her past. She was seeking understanding of a future that seemed to grow more complex with each passing day. The ancient texts spread before her told a story she had never heard, even in the weeks of intensive education that had followed her coronation. Prophecies written in the old script, their meaning obscured by centuries of careful interpretation and deliberate misunderstanding. The silver wolf shall rise when darkness threatens to consume the ancient compact, Moira read aloud, her finger tracing symbols that seemed to glow with their own inner light. She shall bridge the realm of mortals and the domain of the eternal, binding together what was sundered when the world was young. Lyra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground chamber's temperature. The ancient compact, what does that refer to? The agreement made between the first werewolves and the supernatural forces that govern our world, Moira explained, her ancient eyes holding depths of knowledge that seemed almost frightening. In the beginning, wolves, humans, fae, and other mystical beings coexisted under divine oversight. The ancient beast was one of many such entities that maintained the balance. She turned to another page, revealing illustrations that depicted creatures Lyra had only heard about in children's stories, dragons with scales that reflected starlight, fae courts that danced between dimensions, elemental spirits that commanded wind and flame and earth itself. But the compact was broken during the territorial wars. Greed and fear drove the supernatural beings into hiding, leaving mortals to govern themselves without divine guidance. The balance that had maintained peace for millennia began to crumble. Lyra studied the prophecy with growing unease. And my bloodline is somehow connected to restoring this balance. Not just connected, central to it. Moira's voice carried the weight of terrible certainty. The Northern Territories were not simply another werewolf kingdom. They were the guardians of the ancient compact, the bridge between mortal and divine realms. When your bloodline was nearly extinguished, the supernatural world lost its anchor point. The implications crashed over Lyra like a frozen wave. Her personal transformation from servant to queen was not just about reclaiming a stolen throne. It was about fulfilling a cosmic destiny that would affect every supernatural being in existence. The attacks on our territory, she said slowly, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. They were not random. Someone is trying to prevent the prophecy's fulfillment. Several someones, Moira corrected grimly. Word has been spreading through the supernatural underground that the Silver Wolf has awakened. Those who profited from the compact's destruction will do anything to maintain the current disorder. As if summoned by their conversation, a commotion erupted from the tunnels above them. Shouts of alarm, the sound of running feet, the distinctive howl that meant the territory was under attack. But this was not the coordinated assault of enhanced rogues. This was something far more dangerous. Lyra was moving before conscious thought could interfere, her supernatural speed carrying her up the stone steps and into the pack house's main hall. What she found there defied every expectation she might have had about how enemies would approach their territory. The attackers were beautiful. Creatures of impossible elegance stood in the centre of the hall, their forms seeming to shift between human and something else entirely. Fae, she realised with shock. Beings she had thought were nothing more than legend, now standing in her home with expressions of cold hostility. Their leader was tall and pale, with hair like spun moonlight and eyes that held the deep blue of winter ice. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the very air sing with otherworldly music. Lyra Blackthorn, he said, her name sounding strange and terrible in his inhuman accent. "We have come to discuss the prophecy that bears your bloodline's mark." Thane appeared at her side, his body tense with protective fury. She could feel his wolf straining against human form, desperate to defend his mate against beings whose power made the air itself crackle with dangerous energy. "You are not welcome here," Thane said, his voice carrying every ounce of alpha authority he possessed. The Fey leader's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Welcome is not a concept that applies to beings such as ourselves, Wolf King. We go where we will when the need compels us." "What do you want?" Lyra stepped forward, her own power rising to meet the supernatural challenge. Silver light began to flicker around her, responding to the presence of creatures that existed on the borderline between mortal and divine. "To offer you a choice," the Fae said simply. "The ancient compact can be restored, but doing so will require sacrifices that may be more than mortal hearts can bear." He gestured, and the air shimmered like heat distortion. Images appeared in the space between them, visions of what the world had been like when supernatural beings walked openly among mortals. It was beautiful beyond description, a realm where magic flowed like water and impossible wonders were commonplace. But the images also showed the cost: mortal rulers bowing before Fey courts, werewolf packs serving as guardians to dragon hordes, humans living always in the shadow of beings whose power dwarfed their own. "The compact was not an agreement between equals," Lyra said, understanding flooding through her like cold realization. "It was a system of servitude disguised as cooperation." "Truth often appears harsh to those who lack the perspective to see its necessity," the Fey leader replied. "Your bloodline exists to bridge our realms, to ensure that mortal chaos does not threaten the cosmic order that keeps reality itself stable." "And if I refuse?" The temperature in the hall dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Frost began forming on the windows, and the Fey leader's beautiful features took on an edge of terrible promise. "The balance will be restored with or without your cooperation, Silver Wolf, but cooperation would allow your people to survive the transition. Refusal," he shrugged eloquently, "refusal would make them irrelevant to the new order." It was a threat wrapped in diplomatic language, but its meaning was clear as crystal. Submit to supernatural rule, or watch her people be swept aside when the old powers reclaimed their dominion over the world. Lyra felt her wolf rise within her, responding to the challenge with fury that made silver light blaze around her like armour forged from starfire. But underneath the anger was something else, the same wisdom that had guided her transformation from servant to queen, the understanding that true leadership sometimes required choosing between terrible options. "I need time," she said finally, "time to consult with my advisors, to understand fully what you are proposing." The Fey leader studied her with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Time is a luxury that grows shorter with each passing day, Queen of the Northern Territories. Forces are already moving to either restore or permanently destroy the ancient compact. Neutrality is not an option that will remain available much longer." He stepped back, his form beginning to blur at the edges, as if he were becoming one with the shadows that clung to the hall's corners. "You have until the next full moon to decide. Choose wisely, Silver Wolf. The fate of every supernatural being hangs in the balance." The Fae vanished like morning mist touched by sunlight, leaving behind only the scent of winter roses and the lingering chill of otherworldly power. But their message remained, heavy as a mountain and twice as immovable. Lyra sank into the nearest chair, her mind reeling from revelations that changed everything she thought she understood about her role as queen. She had believed her greatest challenge would be governing wisely, protecting her people from mundane threats like territorial disputes and political intrigue. Instead, she was being asked to make a choice that would reshape the fundamental nature of reality itself. "What will you do?" Thane asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes holding the kind of trust that came from absolute faith in his mate's wisdom. Lyra looked around the hall where her people were slowly emerging from their shock, their faces reflecting confusion and fear at the supernatural encounter they had just witnessed. These were the wolves who had accepted her as their queen, who had trusted her to lead them toward a better future. "I will do what I have always done," she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. I will find a third option, one that protects my people while honouring the responsibilities of my bloodline. The prophecy might demand that she bridge mortal and divine realms, but it did not specify the terms of that bridge. And if there was one thing Lyra had learned during her transformation from invisible servant to supernatural queen, it was that the most obvious choice was rarely the only choice. The ancient compact might need to be restored, but perhaps it could be restored on terms that serve justice rather than dominance. Perhaps the bridge between realms could be built on equality rather than submission. She was, after all, no longer the powerless girl who accepted whatever fate others chose for her. She was the silver wolf, proven in combat, crowned by ancient right, and carrying the future of her bloodline beneath her heart. And silver wolves, as the prophecy itself declared, were meant to change the world. 6 months after the Fae delegation's ultimatum, Lyra stood on the ancient ceremonial platform where she had first been crowned. But this time she was not alone. Representatives from every supernatural faction in the known world had gathered in response to her unprecedented call for a new compact. Dragons perched on mountaintops like living jewels. Fae courts materialized from between dimensions with their impossible beauty. Elemental spirits danced through the forest canopy, while ancient vampires emerged from shadows that had hidden them for centuries. The gathering was larger and more diverse than any supernatural convocation in recorded history, and at its centre stood the Silver Wolf Queen, who had dared to suggest that the old ways of dominance and submission could be replaced with something better. "I rejected the Fae Court's demand for restoration of the ancient compact," Lyra announced, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast assembly. "But I did not reject the need for balance between our realms. What I propose instead is a new compact, built on mutual respect rather than enforced hierarchy." A murmur rippled through the crowd, voices in dozens of languages expressing everything from curiosity to outright skepticism. The Fae leader who had first approached her stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Bold words, Silver Wolf, but words alone do not reshape the fundamental order of existence. What makes you believe that cooperation between such different beings is even possible?" Lyra smiled, her hand moving instinctively to rest against the swell of her belly, where their child grew strong and healthy. "Because I have lived it. I was a servant who became a queen through the recognition of those who saw worth where others saw worthlessness. I am mated to an alpha king who chose love over convention, wisdom over tradition. I rule a territory that has prospered by valuing merit over birth, by finding strength in diversity rather than uniformity." She gestured to her pack, who stood arranged around the platform in a display of unity that would have been impossible under the old hierarchical system. Warriors who had been born servants now served as her personal guard. Scholars who had once cleaned floors now advised on matters of territorial law. The transformation was visible to anyone with eyes to see. "The new compact will establish councils where each supernatural faction has equal voice in matters that affect our shared world," she continued. "No single group will hold dominance over others. No being will be required to bow to authority they did not choose to recognize." The dragon representative, an ancient creature whose scales shifted through every colour of flame, spoke with a voice like distant thunder. "And if conflicts arise between factions? If the natural hierarchy that has maintained order for millennia is abandoned, what prevents chaos from consuming everything we have built?" "Justice prevents it," Lyra replied simply. "Laws that apply equally to all beings, regardless of their nature or power. Consequences that match crimes rather than reflecting the victim's status. The same principles that have allowed my territory to thrive under reformed governance." She moved to the centre of the platform, silver light beginning to flicker around her as her power responded to the momentous nature of what she was proposing. "I offer myself as the bridge between realms, as my bloodline was meant to be. But I will not be a bridge that carries only the traffic of the powerful. I will be a bridge that allows all beings to cross toward understanding and cooperation. The negotiation that followed lasted 3 days and nights, with supernatural beings who had not spoken to each other in centuries hammering out the details of a compact that would govern their interactions for generations to come. There were heated arguments, dramatic exits, and moments when it seemed the entire effort would collapse under the weight of ancient grudges and irreconcilable differences. But Lyra held them together through sheer force of will and the growing recognition that she represented something entirely new in their world. A leader who had earned her position through merit rather than inheritance, who understood both powerlessness and authority, who could speak to the concerns of both the mightiest dragon and the humblest forest sprite. The final document was a masterpiece of diplomatic compromise and visionary leadership. It established the Council of Realms, with representatives from every major supernatural faction meeting quarterly to address conflicts and coordinate responses to threats that affected multiple groups. It created the Office of Bridge, held initially by Lyra, but eventually to be passed to others who demonstrated the wisdom and impartiality necessary to mediate between different forms of existence. Most importantly, it enshrined the principle that had guided Lyra's own transformation. Worth was not determined by birth or nature, but by choices and actions that served the greater good. When the compact was finally signed in ceremonies that would become legend, witnessed by beings whose very presence made reality shimmer with otherworldly energy, Lyra felt something shift in the fundamental fabric of the world itself. Magic flowed more freely. Supernatural creatures emerged from hiding places they had maintained for generations, and mortals began to remember that there were wonders in the world beyond their mundane understanding. But perhaps the most significant moment came when the ancient beast materialized at the ceremony's conclusion, its form more solid and present than it had been since Lyra's original choosing. The great wolf approached her with the same deliberate grace she remembered, but now she could sense approval in its ancient presence. "You have exceeded even our hopes, daughter of the Northern Territories," it said, its voice resonating directly in her mind with harmonics of cosmic satisfaction. "The bridge you have built will endure long after your mortal form returns to the earth that gave it life." The beast's massive head lowered toward her swollen belly, and she felt her unborn child stir in response to its presence. The bloodline continues, strengthened by wisdom earned through trial and choice. Your heir will inherit not just power, but understanding of how that power should be wielded. As the ancient beast faded back into whatever realm it called home, Lyra found herself surrounded by her pack family. Thane pulled her into his arms, his eyes bright with pride and love and amazement at what she had accomplished. Elder Moira approached with tears of joy streaming down her weathered cheeks, carrying a bundle that contained the first children's book to be written about the new compact. "The story will be told for generations," Moira said, her voice thick with emotion. "How the Silver Wolf rose from servitude to reshape the world itself, how love conquered prejudice, how wisdom triumphed over tradition." Around them, the celebration was already beginning. Supernatural beings who had been enemies for centuries shared food and stories and laughter. Dragons taught fey younglings to dance through flame. Elemental spirits created displays of natural beauty that took the breath away. Vampire scholars debated philosophy with werewolf historians under stars that seemed brighter than they had in living memory. It was a new world, built on the foundation of one woman's refusal to accept that things had to remain as they had always been. Later that night, when the last of the supernatural dignitaries had departed and the territory had settled into peaceful sleep, Lyra stood once again on the balcony where she had first claimed her crown. But this time, she was not looking out over lands that were simply hers to govern. She was looking out over a world that she had helped reshape, a reality where cooperation was replacing domination and understanding was conquering fear. "Do you ever miss it?" Thane asked, joining her in their favourite spot for quiet reflection. the simplicity of when we thought our biggest challenges would be managing pack politics and territorial disputes. Lyra considered the question, thinking of the servant girl who had once believed she was nobody, who had dreamed of nothing more ambitious than surviving another day without drawing unwanted attention. That girl felt like someone she had known in a past life, familiar but distant. "I miss the certainty of it," she said finally. "When I thought I knew exactly what my life would be, there was a kind of peace in accepting limitation, but I would not trade the uncertainty of possibility for the safety of resignation." She turned to face him, her heart swelling with love for the man who had seen her worth when she could not see it herself, who had chosen her over convention and supported her through every impossible challenge. "Besides, our child will grow up in a world where anything is possible, where worth is determined by character rather than circumstances, where bridges exist to be crossed rather than burned." Thane's hand joined hers on her belly, both of them feeling the strong movements of the heir who would inherit not just their bloodlines, but their vision of what leadership could be. "They will never know what it feels like to be told they are nobody," he said softly. "No," Lyra agreed, her voice filled with the quiet satisfaction of promises kept and dreams realized. "They will know from their first breath that they are somebody, and more importantly, they will understand that everyone else is somebody too." The future stretched before them, bright with possibility and rich with hope. There would be challenges ahead, certainly. The new compact would face tests. Conflicts would arise that would require wisdom and compromise to resolve, and the work of building understanding between different forms of existence would continue for generations. But as Lyra stood in the moonlight with her crown upon her head, her mate's arms around her, and their child growing beneath her heart, she knew with absolute certainty that the foundations they had laid would endure. Love had conquered hierarchy, wisdom had triumphed over tradition, and the servant who had become queen had proven that transformation was not just possible, but inevitable for those brave enough to claim their true worth. The ancient beast had chosen well when it looked past social barriers to recognize the royal heart that beat beneath a servant's clothing. And the silver wolf had chosen even better when she decided that being chosen was not enough, that true queens did not simply accept the power they were given, but use that power to lift others toward their own recognition of what they could become. In the end, that was the greatest magic of all. The ancient beast held her gaze for 3 heartbeats that felt like 3 lifetimes, and then it did something that would be spoken of in whispered legend for generations to come. It stepped back, turned its massive head toward the ceremonial circle where Alpha King Thane waited with growing confusion, and dismissed him with a single, deliberate glance. The rejection was so complete, so absolute, that several pack members gasped audibly. The beast looked at their king, their strongest warrior, their chosen leader, and found him wanting. Not even wanting, really, simply irrelevant. Thane's composure cracked for just an instant, his dark eyes widening as the impossibility of the moment crashed over him like a cold wave. He had prepared for this ceremony his entire life. Every training session, every battle, every decision he had made as Alpha King had been leading to this moment when the ancient beast would recognize him as the pack's spiritual guardian. But the beast was already turning away from him, its attention returning to the servant girl who cowered behind the oak tree like a guilty secret the forest was trying to hide. Lyra wanted to disappear. She wanted to sink into the earth and never surface again, to become one with the bark of the tree at her back, to undo whatever cosmic mistake had placed her in the path of this creature's inexplicable interest. Every instinct she had developed over 15 years of survival screamed at her to run, but her body remained frozen under the weight of supernatural attention. The beast began to walk toward her again, each step deliberate and earth-shaking. The packed earth beneath its paws seemed to respond to its presence, small flowers blooming in its wake as if the very ground recognized something sacred in its passage. The temperature continued to drop until Lyra could see her breath misting in the air, could feel the cold seeping through her worn servant's clothing and into her bones. Behind the beast, she could see the pack beginning to stir from their stunned paralysis. Confused murmurs rippled through the ceremonial circle as they tried to process what they were witnessing. This was not how the stories went. This was not how anything was supposed to happen. The ancient beast stopped directly in front of her, so close that she could feel the supernatural energy radiating from its form like heat from a forge. It was beautiful in the way that storms were beautiful, in the way that mountain avalanches and forest fires were beautiful, terrible and magnificent, and completely beyond mortal understanding. Slowly, with movements that seemed to contain the weight of centuries, the beast lowered its massive head until its muzzle was inches from Lyra's trembling hand. She could feel its breath against her skin, warm despite the frigid air that surrounded them, carrying scents of pine forests and wild moonlight and something ancient that had no name in any mortal tongue. Then it nudged her hand with its nose. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, nothing like the violence she had expected from a creature of such overwhelming power. It felt like being touched by starlight, by the memory of forgotten gods, by something so far beyond her understanding that her mind could barely process the sensation. But her body understood. Something deep inside her, something that had been sleeping for so long, she had forgotten it existed, stirred in response to that touch. Her wolf, the animal spirit that every pack member carried within them, lifted its head for the first time in years and whispered a single word into her consciousness. Chosen. The pack's paralysis finally broke. Voices rose in confusion and denial, fragments of questions and protests that seemed to blend into a single note of cosmic wrongness. How could the beast choose a servant? How could it ignore their Alpha King in favour of someone who had never even been allowed to participate in pack meetings? There must be some mistake. Serena's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with desperate authority. She's nobody. She's nothing. The beast cannot possibly mean to choose her. But the ancient beast paid no attention to the protests. It pressed its muzzle more firmly against Lyra's hand, and she felt something pass between them. Not words exactly, but understanding. Images flashed through her mind. Ancient forests where wolves ran free under silver moonlight, bloodlines that stretched back to the first packs, to the time when the boundary between mortal and divine was thin as morning mist. A power that had been sleeping, hidden, suppressed for reasons she could not yet comprehend. The beast's eyes met hers again, and this time she saw not just recognition, but something that looked almost like relief, as if it had been searching for her for a very long time and had finally found what it was looking for. Alpha King Thane stepped forward, his authority reasserting itself despite the supernatural impossibility unfolding before him. "Ancient One," he said, his voice carrying the command that had never failed to bend others to his will. "Surely there has been some confusion. The servant girl cannot be your choice. She has no training, no bloodline, no power to serve as spiritual guardian." The beast turned its head toward him, and for a moment the grove fell silent again. When it looked back at Lyra, she could have sworn she saw something like amusement in those ancient eyes, as if the very suggestion that bloodlines and training mattered to a creature that had existed since the world was young was so absurd it was almost charming. It nudged her hand one more time, more insistently now, and she felt her wolf stir again. The sensation was like waking from a dream she had not realized she was having, like remembering a song she had never learned to sing. Power flickered somewhere deep inside her, so faint she might have imagined it, but real enough to make her breath catch. The beast stepped back, its task apparently complete, and looked out over the assembled pack with eyes that held the weight of final judgment. Its gaze swept over Thane, over Serena and her companions, over all the powerful wolves who had assumed they understood how the world worked. Then it began to fade. The dissolution was gradual, like morning mist touched by sunlight. The beast's form became translucent, then transparent, then nothing more than a shimmer in the air that might have been heat distortion or imagination. In moments it was gone entirely, leaving only the lingering scent of wild magic and the memory of impossible blue eyes. The ceremony was over. The choice had been made, and not a single soul in the sacred grove could quite believe what they had witnessed. Lyra remained frozen against the oak tree, her hand still tingling from the beast's touch, her mind reeling from the visions it had shared with her. Around the ceremonial circle, pack members began to move and speak again, but their voices seemed to come from very far away, as if she were hearing them through deep water. She had been chosen. She, the servant girl who was supposed to be invisible, who had spent her entire life being told she was nothing, had been selected by the most powerful supernatural entity their world had ever known. The realization should have filled her with triumph, but instead she felt only terror, because she knew with the certainty that came from 15 years of understanding her place in the pack's hierarchy that being chosen was not the same as being accepted, and acceptance, she was beginning to realize, was something she would have to fight for with every breath she had left in her body. The pack dispersed like startled birds, their voices carrying fragments of confusion and disbelief as they fled the sacred grove. Lyra remained pressed against the oak tree, watching them scatter with the desperate urgency of people who had witnessed something that challenged everything they understood about their world. She could hear Serena's voice above the others, sharp with indignation, as she declared to anyone who would listen that there had to be some mistake, some cosmic error that would soon be corrected. But the grove was growing quiet now, empty of all but the lingering scent of wild magic and the memory of ancient eyes that had looked at her and seen something impossible. She was alone, finally, mercifully alone. Lyra sank to her knees beside the oak tree, her legs no longer willing to support her weight. Her hand still tingled where the beast had touched her, the sensation spreading up her arm like warmth from a fire she could not see. She stared at her palm, half expecting to find some mark, some sign of what had passed between them, but her skin looked exactly as it always had. Work roughened and scarred from 15 years of servant's labour, unremarkable in every way, except for the tingling and the way her wolf had stirred at the beast's touch, lifting its head after years of silence like a sleeper waking from a dream. The visions the beast had shared with her came flooding back. Ancient forests where silver wolves ran beneath stars that seemed close enough to touch. Bloodlines that stretched back to the dawn of their kind, to a time when power flowed through the world like water through stone. And something else, something that felt like recognition, like coming home to a place she had never been but had always known existed. "You should not be here alone." The voice came from the grove's edge, deep and commanding in the way that made her spine straighten instinctively. Alpha King Thane stepped into the ceremonial circle, his presence filling the space even without the supernatural weight of the ancient beast. He moved toward her with the fluid grace of a predator, but there was something different in his approach, something almost cautious. Lyra scrambled to her feet, automatically adopting the submissive posture that had kept her alive for 15 years. Head down, shoulders curved inward, making herself as small and unthreatening as possible. "Alpha King, I was just leaving." "Were you?" His footsteps stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could catch the scent that every pack member knew by instinct. Pine and leather and something wild that spoke of absolute authority. "Because it seems to me that you are exactly where you are supposed to be." The words carried a weight she did not understand, an undercurrent that made her look up, despite every survival instinct she had ever developed. His dark eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to flee, but also made something deep inside her chest flutter like caged wings. The ancient beast made a mistake, she whispered, the words coming out as barely more than breath. I am nobody. I have always been nobody. Thane's expression shifted, something that might have been pain flickering across his features. And yet it chose you. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the way his pupils dilated slightly as he looked at her, could feel the way the air between them seemed to thicken with something she had no name for. Her wolf stirred again, responding to his proximity with a restlessness that felt both familiar and completely foreign. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it, raw with confusion and desperation. Why would it choose me over you? You are everything it should want, strong, powerful, born to lead. I am nothing. Are you? His voice dropped to something softer, more dangerous. Because my wolf is telling me something very different right now. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. Lyra felt her breath catch as she realized what he was saying, what his wolf was recognizing in her that his human mind could not yet accept. The mate bond, the connection that existed beyond reason, beyond hierarchy, beyond everything they had been taught about how their world was supposed to work. But before she could respond, before she could even begin to process what this meant, another voice cut through the grove's stillness like a blade. How touching! Serena stepped into the ceremonial circle, her golden hair catching the late afternoon light, her perfect features arranged in an expression of cold fury. The Alpha King comforting the servant girl after her little performance. Thane turned toward the beta female, his body shifting subtly into a protective stance between Serena and Lyra. The movement was unconscious, instinctive, the response of a wolf protecting something precious. Serena, you should be with the others. Should I? Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. When there are clearly matters here that require clarification, such as how a servant girl managed to fool the ancient beast into choosing her over our rightful Alpha King. Lyra felt something cold settle in her stomach. Fool the beast? The implication was clear and deadly. If the pack believed she had somehow manipulated the ceremony, used some kind of trickery or magic to deceive their most sacred entity, they would demand her death. The beast cannot be fooled, Thane said, his voice carrying a warning that would have made most pack members step back immediately. But Serena was not most pack members. She was beta female, born to a bloodline almost as pure as Thane's own, and she had expected to be chosen as his mate when he came of age. The ceremony's outcome had not just embarrassed her, it had shattered the future she had planned since childhood. Cannot be fooled, or simply hasn't encountered deception clever enough to deceive it until now? Serena's gaze shifted to Lyra, and the hatred in her blue eyes was so pure it was almost beautiful. What did you do, little servant? What bargain did you make? What price did you pay for your moment of false glory? I did nothing. The words came out stronger than Lyra had intended, surprising all three of them. Her wolf was stirring again, responding to the threat in Serena's voice with something that felt almost like anger. I did not ask to be chosen. I did not want to be chosen. And yet you were. Serena stepped closer, her movements predatory and precise. How convenient that the beast would choose someone so perfectly positioned to disrupt pack stability. Someone with no bloodline, no training, no loyalty to our ways. Thane's growl rumbled through the grove like distant thunder. Enough. But Serena was beyond listening to commands now, beyond caring about hierarchy or consequences. Her perfect composure was cracking, revealing the fury beneath like lava through fractured stone. You will regret this, she said to Lyra, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout. Whatever you think you have gained today, whatever you think this choosing means, you will learn that some prizes are not worth the cost of claiming them. She turned and stalked away, leaving behind the scent of roses and malice. Thane watched her go, his body still tense with protective instincts, his dark eyes tracking her movement until she disappeared beyond the grove's edge. She meant that, Lyra whispered, fear making her voice shake. Yes. Thane's attention returned to her, and she saw her own fear reflected in his expression. She did. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to voice. The ancient beast's choosing had changed everything, had upset a balance of power that had existed for generations, and Lyra, the servant girl who had spent her life trying to be invisible, was now at the centre of a storm that would reshape their entire world. "What happens now?" she asked. Thane looked at her for a long moment, his gaze moving over her face as if he were memorizing it, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that only she could help him complete. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would alter both their fates. "Now," he said, "we discover who you really are." The summons came at midnight, delivered by a young pack member whose hands shook as he knocked on the servants' quarters door. Lyra had been lying awake on her narrow cot, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the day's impossible events when the soft wrapping pulled her from her spiralling thoughts. "The Alpha King requests your presence in his private chambers," the messenger whispered, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from being asked to deliver messages that defied every social convention their pack had ever known. Lyra's stomach dropped to somewhere around her ankles. Alpha Kings did not summon servant girls to their private chambers, especially not in the dead of night when the pack house was sleeping and no witnesses could attest to what happened behind closed doors. The implications were either scandalous or deadly, and she was not sure which possibility terrified her more. But refusing was not an option, not when the request came from the Alpha King himself, and especially not when her entire world had already been turned upside down by forces beyond her understanding. She followed the messenger through corridors she had walked countless times while carrying out her duties, but tonight they felt different, dangerous. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive, as if the very walls were holding their breath in anticipation of whatever was about to unfold. Thane's chambers occupied the entire top floor of the pack house, a space she had cleaned many times, but never while he was present. Tonight, warm light spilled from beneath his door, and she could hear movement within. The messenger gestured for her to knock, then fled back down the stairs as if his life depended on putting distance between himself and whatever was about to happen. Lyra raised her hand to the heavy wooden door, hesitated, then forced herself to knock before her courage could abandon her entirely. "Enter." His voice carried through the wood like a command from a god, and she found herself obeying before conscious thought could interfere. She pushed the door open and stepped into a world that was as foreign to her as the ancient beast's supernatural realm. The chamber was enormous, easily larger than the entire servants' quarters. Rich tapestries covered the walls, depicting scenes of pack victories and ancient ceremonies. A fire crackled in a stone hearth large enough to roast an entire deer, casting dancing shadows across furniture that looked like it had been carved by master craftsmen from trees that had stood since the world was young. And in the centre of it all, Thane waited. He had changed from his ceremonial garb into simple clothes, dark pants and a white shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the predatory grace with which he moved. His dark hair was dishevelled as if he had been running his hands through it, and his eyes held the kind of intensity that made her want to back toward the door she had just entered through. But she also felt something else, something that made her wolf stir with restless energy. The mate bond, stronger now in the intimate space of his private chambers, hummed between them like a plucked string. It was impossible, inconceivable, but undeniably real. "You came." He sounded almost surprised, as if he had expected her to refuse the summons despite the impossibility of doing so. "You are my Alpha King." The words came out automatically, a lifetime of conditioning making the response effortless. "I serve at your command." Something flickered across his expression, too quick for her to identify. "Do you? Because I find myself wondering exactly who you are, Lyra, and who you serve." The question hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. She had spent 15 years perfecting the art of invisibility, of being so unremarkable that people forgot she existed moments after she left their sight. But there was no hiding under the weight of his attention, no disappearing when every instinct he possessed as an alpha was focused on unravelling the mystery she had unwittingly become. "I am nobody," she whispered, falling back on the truth that had defined her entire existence. "I am a servant, nothing more. The ancient beast disagrees." He moved closer, each step deliberate and measured. "And so does my wolf." The confession made her breath catch. He was acknowledging it, the impossible connection that existed between them, the bond that should not exist but refused to be denied. Her own wolf responded to his proximity with a restlessness that was becoming harder to ignore, a stirring of something that felt both familiar and terrifyingly foreign. "My wolf has been silent for years," she said, the words escaping before she could consider the wisdom of such honesty. "I thought it was dead." "Suppressed," he said, the word carrying a weight of implication that made her look up sharply. "Not dead, hidden." He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could catch the scent that made something deep in her chest tighten with longing she had no right to feel. When he reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so powerful, she did not pull away. "Why?" The question was barely more than breath. "Why would the beast choose me? Why would your wolf recognize me? I am nothing special." "Are you?" His thumb brushed across her lower lip, the touch so light it might have been imagined, but it sent lightning through every nerve ending she possessed. "Because everything I have been taught about mate bonds tells me that they do not choose randomly, they do not make mistakes." The mate bond. He was saying it out loud now, acknowledging the impossible connection that had sparked between them the moment the ancient beast had made its choice. But acknowledging it and accepting it were two very different things, and the weight of everything that stood between them pressed down on her like a physical force. "I am a servant," she said again, desperately clinging to the identity that had kept her safe for 15 years. "You are the Alpha King. This cannot be." "Cannot be?" His smile held no humour, only a kind of desperate frustration. "Do you think I have not told myself the same thing 1,000 times since this afternoon? Do you think I have not tried to convince myself that what I am feeling is some kind of cosmic mistake?" His hand dropped from her face, and immediately she missed the warmth of his touch. He turned away from her, moving to stare into the fire as if it might hold answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "The pack elders have already approached me," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "They demand explanations for what happened in the grove. They want to know how I will handle the situation, how I will restore order and stability after such an unprecedented disruption." Lyra felt cold settle in her bones. Of course the elders would be concerned. The ancient beast's choosing had upset a balance of power that had existed for generations, had called into question everything they understood about hierarchy and bloodlines and the natural order of their world. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing." He turned back to her, his eyes reflecting firelight like dark mirrors. "Because I do not yet understand what happened myself, but I know that I cannot simply dismiss it, cannot pretend that the beast made an error, or that the bond I feel toward you is some kind of temporary madness." "The bond," she whispered the words like a prayer or a curse. "Is it real?" "Real enough that being in the same room with you is testing every ounce of control I possess." The admission came out raw, honest in a way that made her chest tighten with emotions she could not name. "Real enough that when Serena threatened you this afternoon, my first instinct was to tear out her throat for daring to speak to my mate with such disrespect." His mate. The words hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Lyra felt her wolf lift its head fully for the first time in years, responding to the claim with a surge of recognition that made her gasp. But reality crashed back down on them like a cold wave. The pack would never accept a servant as their alpha queen. The elders would demand that Thane choose someone suitable, someone with the bloodline and training necessary to stand beside him as an equal. Someone like Serena, who had been groomed for the role since childhood. "They will never accept me," she said, voicing the truth that lay at the heart of their impossible situation. "No." His honesty was brutal and necessary. "They will not as you are now." The qualification in his words made her look up sharply. "As I am now?" Thane studied her face for a long moment, his expression thoughtful and calculating in the way that had made him a successful leader despite his youth. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a decision that would change everything. "There are questions that need answers," he said, "about who you really are, about why the ancient beast would choose you over me, about why my wolf recognizes you as mate when logic says it should be impossible. And if there are no answers, if I really am just a servant girl who somehow caught the beast's attention through cosmic accident?" His smile was sharp as a blade. "Then we will deal with that reality when we come to it. But until then, until we know the truth, you are under my personal protection. No one will harm you while I draw breath." The promise settled around her like armour, warm and strong and more comforting than anything she had felt in 15 years of servitude. But it also carried implications that terrified her, because protection from the Alpha King came with a price that she was not sure she was prepared to pay. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Thane said, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see straight through to her soul. "We discover who you really are, and what the ancient beast saw in you that the rest of us have been blind to." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, casting dancing shadows on the walls, as if even the light could not decide what shape the future would take. But for the first time since the ceremony had turned her world upside down, Lyra felt something other than terror. She felt hope, dangerous, impossible, but undeniably real. The knock came 3 days later, so soft Lyra almost missed it over the sound of her own restless pacing. She had been confined to a small chamber adjacent to the Alpha King's quarters, ostensibly for her protection, but feeling more like house arrest with each passing hour. The pack house hummed with whispered conversations that died whenever she appeared, and the weight of curious stares followed her everywhere she went. "Come!" she called, expecting another meal delivery, or perhaps another summons from Thane. Instead, a figure in a deep hooded cloak slipped through the door like shadow made manifest. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs until the visitor pushed back her hood to reveal ancient features lined with wisdom and something that might have been kindness. Elder Moira, the pack's historian and keeper of the old knowledge, a woman so ancient that some whispered she had been present at the founding of their territory. Her silver hair was braided with beads that caught the lamplight, and her pale blue eyes held depths that seemed to contain centuries of secrets. "Child," her voice was soft as winter wind through pine branches, "we must speak. Elder Moira." Lyra automatically dipped into the respectful bow she had been taught to show all pack elders. "How may I serve you?" The old woman's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "Serve me? Oh, my dear girl, I think you have that precisely backward." She moved to the chamber's small window, her gnarled hands clasping behind her back as she gazed out at the forest beyond. "Do you know why I have spent 73 years maintaining the pack's historical records? Copying ancient texts, preserving bloodline charts, keeping track of marriages and births and deaths that most consider irrelevant to modern life." Lyra shook her head, uncertain where this conversation was leading, but sensing that it would change everything. "Because the past has a way of reaching into the present when we least expect it," Moira said. "Because bloodlines that we think are extinct sometimes surface in the most unexpected places. Because truth has a way of demanding recognition, no matter how deeply we try to bury it." She turned from the window, fixing Lyra with a stare that seemed to see straight through to her bones. "Tell me, child, what do you remember of your parents?" The question hit like a physical blow. Lyra had not spoken of her parents in years, had learned that mentioning them only brought pain and uncomfortable questions she could not answer. "They died in the Eastern Wars. I was very young." "Yes, they did die in those wars, but not as you have been told." Moira moved closer, her presence commanding despite her small stature. "Your parents did not die as foot soldiers in some nameless battle. They died defending secrets that others would have killed to possess." Lyra's breath caught. "I don't understand." "No, I suspect you do not, but you will." Moira reached into her cloak and withdrew a leather-wrapped bundle that looked older than the pack house itself. "Come with me, child. There are things you need to see, things that will explain why the ancient beast chose you, and why certain members of this pack are so desperate to see you disappear." The corridors beneath the pack house were older than the structure above, carved from living stone and lined with torches that burned with flames that never seemed to consume their fuel. Lyra had known these passages existed, had heard whispered stories of ancient archives and forgotten chambers, but she had never imagined she would walk them herself. Moira led her deeper underground, past chambers filled with scrolls and books, past walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering torchlight. The air grew thick with the scent of old parchment and something else, something wild and powerful that made Lyra's suppressed wolf stir with increasing restlessness. They stopped before a door marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly, runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Moira pressed her palm to the centre of the door, spoke words in the old language that Lyra felt rather than heard, and the ancient barrier swung open with the whisper of centuries-old hinges. The chamber beyond took Lyra's breath away. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with genealogy charts, bloodline maps that traced pack lineages back to the very beginning of their people. Golden threads connected names across generations, creating patterns so complex they looked like spiderwebs spun from starlight. But it was the largest chart, the one that dominated the far wall, that made Lyra's knees buckle with shock. Her name was there, not at the bottom as a recent addition, but near the top, connected to bloodlines that glowed with silver light. Royal bloodlines. Lines that should have been extinct, that everyone believed had been wiped out in the territorial wars of the previous generation. "Lyra Blackthorn," Moira said softly, her voice carrying the weight of revelation. "Last daughter of the Northern Territories, rightful heir to the Silver Crown, Alpha Queen by birth, not by choice." The words hit like thunder, reshaping everything Lyra thought she knew about herself in an instant. She stared at the chart, at the silver threads that connected her name to queens and kings, stretching back through the centuries, and felt her world tilt on its axis. "Impossible," she whispered. "I am nobody. I am a servant." "You are a survivor," Moira corrected gently. "Hidden in plain sight, your power bound by magic so old and complex that even I am only beginning to understand it." She unwrapped the leather bundle, revealing ancient books whose pages seemed to glow with their own inner light. "Your parents knew they were being hunted. The Northern Territories had fallen, their royal family marked for extinction by those who sought to prevent any future challenge to the new order, so they made a choice." Moira opened one of the books, revealing pages covered in symbols that made Lyra's eyes water. "They bound your power, suppressed your wolf, made you invisible to those who would seek to harm you. They gave their lives to ensure that you would survive, even if it meant you would never know who you truly were." "The binding," Lyra breathed, understanding beginning to dawn like sunrise after an endless night. "That is why my wolf has been silent. Silent but not gone, waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst to break free." Moira's smile held centuries of patience. The ancient beast's choosing was not random, child. It recognized what the binding could not completely hide. Royal blood calls to royal blood. Power recognizes power, even when it is buried beneath layers of magic and deliberate forgetting. Lyra sank into a chair that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of ancient oak. her mind reeling from revelations that changed everything she thought she knew about herself. If this is true, if I really am what you say I am, then why tell me now? Why reveal the secret my parents died to protect? Moira's expression grew grave. Because the binding is weakening, has been weakening for months, though you may not have noticed the subtle changes. Your wolf stirring, your increased sensitivity to supernatural energy, the way power calls to power, even when you try to ignore it. She moved to another section of the charts, pointing to bloodlines that pulsed with angry red light. And because there are those in this pack who have always known the truth about you, who have been watching and waiting for any sign that your power might return. They eliminated your family once to secure their own position. Do you think they will hesitate to eliminate you if they realize the binding is failing? The implication hit like ice water in her veins. Lyra thought of Serena's hatred, of the way certain pack members had always treated her with a cruelty that seemed excessive even for their rigid hierarchy. They had not been persecuting her because she was nobody. They had been persecuting her because she was somebody, and they knew it. "What do I do?" she asked, the question barely more than a whisper. Moira smiled, and for the first time since entering the chamber, Lyra saw something like hope in the old woman's eyes. "We break the binding, we restore your power, we reclaim your birthright." She moved to a section of the wall covered in ritual implements, tools that looked like they had been forged in starlight and tempered with moonbeams. "It will not be easy. The magic that holds your wolf in check is complex, woven by your parents' desperate love and reinforced by years of believing yourself powerless. Breaking it will require courage, pain, and a willingness to embrace who you were always meant to be." Lyra looked at the charts again, at the silver threads connecting her to generations of queens who had ruled with wisdom and strength. She thought of the ancient beast's recognition, of Thane's wolf calling to something it sensed within her, of 15 years spent believing she was nothing when she had always been everything. "How long do we have?" "Not long." Moira's voice carried urgency now, the weight of approaching danger. "Those who killed your parents are already suspicious. The ancient beast's choosing has awakened questions they hoped would never be asked. We must act quickly before they decide that even a bound royal is too dangerous to allow to live." The torchlight flickered as if responding to the gravity of their conversation, and Lyra felt her suppressed wolf stir with something that felt almost like anticipation. Somewhere deep inside her, power that had been sleeping for 15 years began to wake. "Then let us begin," she said, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "Let us discover who I really am." Moira nodded, already reaching for the ritual tools. "Indeed, Your Majesty, let us reclaim your crown." The ritual to break the binding would require 3 days of preparation, Moira explained as they emerged from the ancient archives. 3 days of gathering materials, preparing sacred space, and slowly weakening the magical constraints that had held Lyra's power dormant for 15 years. 3 days during which they would have to maintain absolute secrecy, because discovery would mean death for them both. But secrets, Lyra was beginning to learn, had a way of revealing themselves at the worst possible moments. She was returning from the forest with a bundle of moonbell flowers, one of the rare herbs required for the unbinding ritual, when she noticed the silence. The usual chatter of servants going about their evening duties was absent, replaced by an oppressive quiet that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Her newly stirring wolf sensed danger before her human mind could process it, sending warning signals that made her steps slow as she approached the pack house's rear entrance. The scent hit her just as she reached for the door handle. Bitter almonds and something else, something that made her stomach clench with primal fear. Poison, the same kind that had been used to eliminate political enemies during the territorial wars, according to the historical texts Moira had shown her. Lyra dropped the moonbell flowers and ran. She found the source of the smell in the servants' kitchen, where her friend Mira lay convulsing on the stone floor. The young woman who had shared meals with Lyra for the past 5 years, who had covered for her when duties ran long, who had never shown anything but kindness in a world that offered precious little of it. "Mira!" Lyra dropped to her knees beside her friend, whose lips were already turning blue from the poison coursing through her veins. "What happened? What did you eat?" The soup," Mira gasped, her hand clutching weakly at Lyra's sleeve. "Your favourite. Made it special for you. Was supposed to be a celebration." Horror crashed over Lyra like a frozen wave. The soup had been intended for her. Mira had prepared Lyra's favourite meal as a kindness, had tasted it the way cooks always did, and had inadvertently consumed poison meant to kill the last heir of the Northern Territories. "Help!" Lyra screamed, her voice echoing through the corridors. "Someone help! Poisoning in the kitchen!" Footsteps thundered toward them, but Lyra could already see it was too late. Mira's convulsions were slowing, her breathing becoming shallow and irregular. The poison was too strong, had been in her system too long. "I'm sorry," Mira whispered, her eyes finding Lyra's face. Should have been more careful." "No," Lyra said fiercely, gathering her friend into her arms. "This is not your fault. None of this is your fault." But even as she spoke the words, Lyra could feel something stirring deep inside her. Her wolf, responding to grief and rage with a power that made the air around them shimmer with heat. For just a moment, golden light flickered around her hands where they touched Mira's skin, and she felt the binding that had held her abilities in check crack just a little wider. Not enough to save her friend. Not nearly enough. Thane arrived with the pack's healer, just as Mira drew her last breath. Lyra felt the exact moment her friend's spirit left her body, felt the absence like a hole torn in the fabric of the world. She looked up at Thane through tears she had not realized she was crying, and saw her own rage reflected in his dark eyes. Who did this? His voice carried the kind of fury that had won wars and toppled kingdoms. "The soup was meant for me," Lyra said, the words coming out flat with shock. "Mira made my favourite, wanted to celebrate something. She died because she was kind to me." Thane's growl filled the kitchen like rolling thunder. He moved to examine the pot that still sat on the cooking fire, its contents now obviously tainted with enough poison to kill a dozen wolves. When he turned back to Lyra, his expression was that of an alpha king contemplating war. "This ends now," he said. But before he could elaborate, Serena appeared in the kitchen doorway, her perfect features arranged in an expression of shocked concern that did not quite reach her eyes. "What has happened? We heard screaming." She stopped when she saw Mira's body, her gaze moving from the dead servant to Lyra's tear-stained face to the pot of poisoned soup. If Lyra had not known better, she might have believed the surprise on Serena's face was genuine. "How terrible," Serena said, her voice carrying just the right note of sympathy. "Poor Mira, she was always so careless with her cooking. I suppose it was only a matter of time before she made a fatal mistake." The casual dismissal of her friend's death, the implication that Mira had somehow poisoned herself through incompetence, sent fury through Lyra's veins like liquid fire. Her wolf snarled inside her chest, pressing against the binding with enough force to make golden light flicker around her clenched fists. "She did not make a mistake," Lyra said, her voice deadly quiet. "Someone poisoned food intended for me, and she died because she was kind enough to taste it first." Serena's eyebrows rose in perfect arcs of feigned surprise. "Poisoned? How dramatic, though I suppose servants do have active imaginations when tragedy strikes." The condescension in her tone, the casual cruelty disguised as concern, was too much. Lyra rose to her feet, power crackling around her like storm lightning as 15 years of suppressed rage finally found a target worthy of it. "I know what you did." The words came out with such force that the very air in the kitchen seemed to vibrate with threat. Serena took an involuntary step backward, her perfect composure cracking just enough to reveal the calculating intelligence beneath. "I have no idea what you mean," she said, but her voice had lost some of its steady confidence. "Don't you?" Lyra stepped closer, her newly awakening abilities making the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "You knew the poison would not kill me quickly enough to prevent questions. You knew that if I died obviously murdered, Thane would tear the pack apart looking for my killer, so you chose something subtle, something that could be explained as an accident." Serena's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "You give me far too much credit, little servant. Why would I waste time plotting against someone so beneath my notice?" But her eyes betrayed her. In their blue depths, Lyra saw not just hatred, but fear. Fear of what Lyra was becoming, of what she might remember, of what she might reclaim if given the chance. "Because you know," Lyra said softly, the truth crystallizing with painful clarity. "You have always known who I really am." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Thane's sharp intake of breath. He was staring at Lyra with an expression of dawning understanding, as if pieces of a puzzle he had been trying to solve were finally clicking into place. "Thane," Serena said quickly, turning her attention to the Alpha King with practiced charm. "Surely you cannot take seriously the ravings of a servant girl driven mad by grief. The poor thing has clearly been traumatized by her friend's accident." "Accident?" Thane's voice was softer than winter wind, more dangerous than a blade at the throat. "Is that what we are calling it?" He moved to stand beside Lyra, his presence warm and protective at her back. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. "There will be an investigation, a thorough one. Every person who had access to this kitchen today will be questioned, and anyone found to have lied will face judgment under pack law." Serena's face went pale beneath her perfect makeup. "Of course, Alpha King. We must all cooperate with such an important investigation." But as she turned to leave, she paused just long enough to meet Lyra's eyes. The message in her gaze was clear as winter starlight. This was only the beginning. When they were alone, except for Mira's cooling body, Thane pulled Lyra into his arms. She went willingly, needing the solid warmth of him to anchor her in a world that seemed to be shifting beneath her feet like sand. "I'm sorry," he said, his lips against her hair. "I should have seen this coming, should have protected you better." "You could not have known." But even as she said it, Lyra knew the truth. They had both been naive to think her enemies would wait patiently while she discovered her identity and claimed her power. The ancient beast's choosing had started a clock ticking, and they were running out of time faster than either of them had realized. "The ritual," she said, pulling back to look into his eyes. "Moira said it would take 3 days to prepare, but we do not have 3 days. They will not wait that long to try again." Thane's expression was grim as granite. "Then we accelerate the timeline, tonight if necessary." "Tonight might not be soon enough." Lyra looked down at Mira's peaceful face, at the friend who had died for the crime of showing kindness to the wrong person. "They know I am getting stronger. They can sense the binding weakening. The next attempt will not be subtle." As if summoned by her words, a howl rose from somewhere in the forest beyond the pack house. Then another, and another. The sound was wrong somehow, carrying notes of violence and predatory hunger that made Lyra's blood run cold. Thane went rigid, his head tilted as he listened to the otherworldly chorus. When he looked at her, his eyes held the kind of fear she had never seen in them before. "Those are not our wolves," he said. The howls grew closer, more numerous, until they seemed to surround the pack house entirely. Through the kitchen window, Lyra could see shadows moving between the trees, forms too large and too wrong to be natural wolves. Her enemies had decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. The hunt for the last daughter of the Northern Territories had begun in earnest. The attack came at dawn, when the forest mist still clung to the ground like ghostly fingers, and the pack house lay quiet in the fragile peace of early morning. Lyra had not slept, had spent the night pacing her chamber while supernatural howls echoed through the darkness, and Thane coordinated defences with his most trusted warriors. She was standing at her window, watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson, when the first silver-tipped arrow shattered the glass beside her head. The arrow embedded itself in the wooden frame with a sound like breaking bones, its metal tip gleaming with the kind of poison that could kill even the strongest wolf. If she had been standing 6 inches to the left, if she had not turned at that precise moment to look toward the forest, she would have been dead before she hit the floor. Instead, she was alive and running. "Thane!" Her scream echoed through the corridors as more arrows began flying through windows throughout the pack house. She could hear shouts of alarm, the sound of furniture being overturned as pack members scrambled for cover, the distinctive whistle of projectiles cutting through air. This was not the subtle poisoning attempt of the previous day. This was open warfare. Lyra burst into the main hall to find chaos. Pack members in various states of undress were diving behind overturned tables and stone pillars as arrows continued to pour through shattered windows. The acrid smell of the poison coating the arrowheads filled the air, making her eyes water and her throat burn. She found Thane barricaded behind the massive stone hearth, his face grim as he shouted orders to warriors who were trying to reach defensive positions. When he saw her, relief flooded his features for just a moment before being replaced by fierce protectiveness. "How many?" he called to a warrior who had just rolled behind cover beside them. "At least 20, maybe more. They have us surrounded, positioned in the tree line with clear sight lines to every window and door." Thane cursed with creativity that would have impressed a sailor. "Silver tips." "Every arrow. Someone spent serious coin on this ambush." Lyra felt cold settle in her bones. Silver-tipped arrows were not just deadly to werewolves. They were expensive, difficult to obtain, and highly illegal in most territories. Whoever was orchestrating this attack had resources, connections, and absolutely no concern for pack law or supernatural treaties. "We need to get you out of here," Thane said to her, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Where?" She gestured toward the windows, where arrows continued to streak past in deadly profusion. "They have every exit covered." As if to emphasize her point, an arrow punched through the wooden shutters not 3 feet from their position, its silver tip gleaming with malevolent light. The poison on it was so concentrated that the wood began to smoke where it made contact. "The tunnels," Thane said grimly. "The same passages Moira showed you. They connect to the forest a half-mile from here." It was a good plan, Lyra thought. It might even work if they could reach the tunnel entrance without being seen by the archers who had them pinned down like rabbits in a warren. But then the temperature in the great hall began to drop. The change was subtle at first, just a coolness that might have been a draught from the broken windows. But it intensified rapidly, becoming cold enough to turn their breath to visible mist, cold enough to make frost form on the stone walls despite the summer morning outside. Lyra's wolf stirred, responding to the supernatural chill with a restlessness that bordered on panic. She could feel the binding that held her power in check, beginning to crack under the pressure of mortal danger. Could sense abilities she had never known she possessed, pressing against magical constraints that were finally, inevitably, beginning to fail. "Something's wrong," she whispered. The arrows stopped. The sudden silence was somehow more terrifying than the constant whistle of projectiles had been. Through the broken windows, Lyra could hear movement in the forest, but it was not the sound of human attackers repositioning for a better angle. It was something else, something that made her skin crawl with primitive fear. "Thane," she said, her voice barely more than breath, "those are not regular assassins out there." He was already reaching the same conclusion, his enhanced senses picking up scents and sounds that painted a picture none of them wanted to see. Rogues, enhanced rogues from the smell of them. Lyra's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Rogues were werewolves who had been cast out from their packs, who had survived alone in the wilderness until madness and desperation had stripped away everything human about them. They were dangerous enough individually, but enhanced rogues were something else entirely. Rogues who had been given artificial strength through dark magic or forbidden alchemy, who retained just enough intelligence to use weapons while possessing none of the restraint that kept civilized wolves from becoming monsters. Someone had not just hired assassins to kill her. They had hired an army of supernatural nightmares. The first one came through the eastern window like a shadow given teeth and claws. It was massive, easily twice the size of a normal wolf, with fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural red fire that spoke of magic and madness, and when it opened its mouth to snarl, she could see that its teeth had been artificially sharpened to razor points. Thane was moving before conscious thought could interfere, shifting to his wolf form in mid-leap as he intercepted the creature's charge. The two wolves crashed together in a tangle of fur and fury, their snarls echoing through the great hall like the sound of worlds ending. But even as Thane engaged the first attacker, more were pouring through windows and doors. Enhanced rogues with glowing eyes and unnatural strength, their movements coordinated in a way that spoke of careful training despite their obvious madness. The pack's warriors shifted to meet them, but it quickly became clear that they were outmatched. These were not ordinary opponents who could be defeated through skill and courage alone. These were supernatural weapons, designed specifically to kill werewolves and enhanced beyond natural limits. Lyra watched in horror as one of the rogues caught a pack warrior across the chest, with claws that left wounds too deep and too precise to be natural. She saw another warrior go down under the combined assault of two attackers who moved with inhuman coordination, their tactics clearly rehearsed. They were losing. Badly. And through it all, she could feel the binding around her power stretching, cracking, beginning to fail under the pressure of watching her new family being slaughtered before her eyes. The breaking point came when she saw one of the rogues corner Elena, the pack's youngest warrior, barely 18, and fresh from her first shift. The girl was brave, Lyra would give her that, but she was no match for a creature that had been artificially enhanced to kill wolves twice her size. The rogue's claws were descending toward Elena's throat when something inside Lyra finally, completely, irreversibly snapped. Power exploded outward from her like a supernova, silver light so bright it turned the great hall into a miniature sun. The magical binding that had held her abilities dormant for 15 years shattered like glass, releasing power that had been building pressure for more than a decade. Her transformation was not the gentle shift that most werewolves experienced. It was violent, painful, and accompanied by the sound of reality itself, bending under the weight of awakening royal blood. Her bones cracked and reformed, her spine elongated, her muscles grew dense with supernatural strength that made the enhanced rogues look like house cats by comparison. When the silver light faded, a wolf stood where Lyra had been. But not just any wolf, a silver wolf, the mark of true royalty, the bloodline that had been thought extinct for a generation. She was beautiful in the way that storms were beautiful, terrible in the way that avalanches were terrible, and when she opened her mouth to howl, the sound carried power that made the ancient stones of the pack house resonate in harmony. The rogues froze. Every enhanced nightmare that had been terrorizing the pack, warriors stopped mid-attack, their glowing red eyes fixed on the silver wolf with something that might have been recognition or might have been fear. Lyra looked at the rogue that had been about to kill Elena, and for the first time in her life she was not the one who was afraid. She moved like liquid lightning, covering the distance between them in a single bound. Her claws, naturally sharp and enhanced by royal blood, opened the rogue's throat before it could react. Her teeth, designed by evolution and ancestry to kill enemies of the crown, clamped down on its spine and ended its artificial existence with surgical precision. The other rogues tried to run. None of them made it to the windows. Lyra moved through them like judgment made manifest, her newfound strength and speed turning what had been a massacre of pack wolves into a slaughter of their attackers. Each strike was precise, efficient, guided by instincts that had been awakening since the ancient beast's recognition and were now fully unleashed. When the last rogue fell, silence returned to the great hall, but it was a different silence than before, heavy with the weight of witnessed impossibility and the scent of spilled blood that belonged to creatures that should not have existed. Thane, back in human form and bleeding from several deep wounds, stared at her with an expression that contained equal parts awe and desire. Around the hall, pack warriors who had been moments from death looked at the silver wolf with the kind of reverence usually reserved for legends. Lyra shifted back to human form, the transformation easier now that her power was no longer artificially constrained. She stood naked among the bodies of her enemies, silver light still flickering around her like residual starfire, and met Thane's gaze without flinching. "Now you know," she said, her voice carrying harmonics of power that made the very air shimmer. "Now you all know who I really am." Thane crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of how close they had come to losing everything. When he kissed her, she could taste victory and recognition and something deeper, something that felt like coming home to a place she had never been but had always belonged. "My queen," he whispered against her lips, and for the first time in 15 years of believing she was nothing, Lyra finally understood that she had always been everything. The Pack Council chamber had never felt so small, despite being the largest formal space in the entire compound. Ancient stone walls that had witnessed generations of leadership decisions now seemed to press inward as 23 pairs of eyes focused on the silver-haired woman who stood beside their Alpha King, with blood still drying under her fingernails. Elder Marcus, the Pack's senior councilman, cleared his throat with the kind of authoritative rumble that had been intimidating lesser wolves for 40 years. Today it sounded more uncertain than commanding. "Alpha King Thane, the council requests clarification regarding the events of this morning." Thane's hand found Lyra's, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. She could feel the mate bond humming between them, stronger now that her power was no longer artificially suppressed, carrying undertones of fierce pride and unwavering support. "The events are quite clear, Marcus," Thane said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had never needed to be raised to be obeyed. "Our pack was attacked by enhanced rogues. The attack was repelled. Our people are safe." "Yes, but how?" Elder Sarah's voice cut through the formal atmosphere like a blade. 20 enhanced rogues, creatures that should have slaughtered our finest warriors, and they were defeated by... She gestured vaguely toward Lyra, clearly struggling with how to describe what they had all witnessed. "By their rightful queen," Thane said simply. The silence that followed was so complete that Lyra could hear her own heartbeat echoing in the stone chamber. She watched the faces of the pack leadership, saw confusion and disbelief, and in some cases the dawning recognition that the world they thought they understood had just changed forever. Serena, who had remained conspicuously silent since the council had been called to order, finally spoke. "Surely you cannot be serious, Alpha King. A servant girl who happened to get lucky in combat cannot simply declare herself royalty." "She has not declared anything." Thane's voice dropped to the dangerous quiet that preceded either exile or execution. "I am declaring it, based on evidence that has been presented to me, testimony from our most trusted historian, and the undeniable proof of royal bloodline demonstrated through supernatural ability." He gestured to Elder Moira, who had been waiting in the shadows with a collection of ancient texts and genealogy charts. The old woman stepped forward, her arms full of documentation that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "The bloodline records are clear," Moira said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute historical authority. "Lyra is the last surviving heir of the Northern Territories, daughter of King Aldrich and Queen Elena Blackthorn. Her parents died protecting her identity, binding her power to keep her safe from those who would eliminate any threat to the new territorial order. She spread the genealogy charts across the council table, the silver threads connecting Lyra's name to generations of royalty visible even in the chamber's dim light. The ancient beast's recognition, the mate bond with our Alpha King, the silver wolf form that marks true royalty, all of it confirms what the written records have preserved. Elder Marcus leaned forward to study the charts, his weathered face creasing with concentration. These records, they have been in our archives for how long? Since the founding of this pack, Moira replied. Maintained in secret, as is tradition when royal bloodlines go into hiding. The Northern Territory's fall was engineered, their royal family hunted to extinction by those who feared their power, or so we were led to believe. Lyra felt the weight of every gaze in the chamber, but instead of the crushing invisibility she had lived with for 15 years, she now experienced their attention as acknowledgement, recognition. She was no longer the servant girl trying to disappear into the background. She was the queen they had never known they were sheltering. The transformation, Elder Sarah said slowly, clearly still processing what she had witnessed. The silver wolf, that cannot be faked or learned. It is either genuine royal blood or nothing, Thane finished. There is no other explanation for what you saw, what we all saw. Councilman David, one of the pack's most conservative voices, shook his head in confusion. But how do we proceed? Even if she is legitimate royalty, she has no training in leadership, no experience with pack governance. How can she assume a position of authority over wolves who have spent their lives learning to command? It was a fair question, Lyra acknowledged silently. Royal blood might give her supernatural abilities and the right to claim a throne, but it did not automatically grant the knowledge needed to rule wisely. The pack deserved leaders who could protect and guide them, not just shift into impressive wolf forms. She will learn, Thane said, his confidence in her absolute and unwavering, as all leaders learn through experience and guidance from those with wisdom to share. But her right to rule does not depend on her current knowledge. It depends on her bloodline, her power, and the recognition of forces greater than any of us. Serena's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. How convenient! The mysterious servant girl turns out to be secret royalty, just in time to claim a throne she has no qualifications for. Forgive me if I find the timing suspiciously perfect. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poisoned fire. Lyra felt her newly awakened wolf stir with anger at the implication, but she forced herself to remain calm. Serena was playing a dangerous game, questioning not just Lyra's legitimacy, but the judgment of the ancient beast itself. "Are you suggesting that the ancient beast was deceived?" Thane's voice carried a warning that should have made any sane wolf back down immediately. But Serena had moved beyond the bounds of sanity sometime in the past 3 days. "I am suggesting that there are forces in this world capable of illusion, Alpha King, magic that can fool even supernatural entities if wielded by those skilled enough to use it." The temperature in the chamber began to drop, not the supernatural chill that preceded the ancient beast's appearance, but something else, something that radiated from Lyra herself as her power responded to the direct challenge to her legitimacy. "Careful, Serena," Lyra said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the stone walls resonate. "You are accusing me of crimes that would require abilities far beyond what any servant could possess. Dark magic, illusion work, the kind of power that takes generations of training to master." She stepped away from Thane's protective presence, moving toward the council table with the fluid grace that came from enhanced supernatural abilities. "If I possessed such power all along, why would I have spent 15 years scrubbing floors and enduring your cruelty? What possible purpose could such an elaborate deception serve?" Serena's perfect composure cracked slightly. "Perhaps you were waiting for the right moment. Perhaps you needed time to perfect your illusions before attempting to seize power." "Or perhaps," Elder Moira interjected dryly, "she is exactly what she appears to be, the rightful heir to a throne that was stolen through murder and conspiracy, finally reclaiming her birthright after years of enforced hiding. The old woman fixed Serena with a stare that seemed to see straight through to her bones. Though now that we are discussing conspiracy and deception, there are questions that should be asked about how enhanced rogues managed to coordinate an attack on our territory. Such creatures do not organize themselves. Someone hired them, equipped them, pointed them at specific targets. The implications settled over the chamber like winter fog, cold and ominous. Lyra saw several council members glance towards Serena with suddenly suspicious eyes. The timing of the attack, coming so soon after Lyra's identity had begun to emerge, was too convenient to be coincidental. "You cannot seriously be suggesting that I would hire rogues to attack our own pack," Serena said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I am suggesting that enhanced rogues require significant resources to hire and direct," Moira replied calmly. "Resources that would be available to someone with connections to territorial leadership, someone with access to pack finances, someone with strong motivation to eliminate a specific target before that target could claim power that would threaten existing arrangements." Thane was studying Serena with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for enemy territory. "The silver-tipped arrows, those are expensive, illegal in most territories. Someone with considerable influence would be needed to obtain them in such quantities." "And the poison used on Mira's soup," Lyra added, her own pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "The same type used for political assassinations during the territorial wars, not something a casual murderer would have access to." The evidence was circumstantial, but damning. Serena had motive, means, and opportunity for both assassination attempts. More importantly, she had reacted to each failed attempt with escalating desperation, moving from subtle poison to open warfare in a matter of days. "This is preposterous," Serena said, but Lyra could smell fear beneath her indignation. "You have no proof of anything beyond wild speculation and convenient timing?" "Don't we?" Thane's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Elder Marcus, I believe pack law provides for formal investigation when serious accusations are made against high-ranking members." Marcus nodded slowly. "Trial by examination, if evidence warrants it. The accused submits to truth-sensing by our most powerful telepaths, or accepts trial by combat if telepathic examination is refused." The colour drained from Serena's face. Truth-sensing would expose every lie she had ever told, every conspiracy she had ever participated in, every crime she had committed in service of her own ambition. Trial by combat would pit her against opponents who now knew she was responsible for attacks on their pack. Serena's voice faltered for the first time since Lyra had known her. "I invoke my right to time for preparation. 24 hours to consult with advisors and decide on my course of action." "Granted," Thane said formally, "but you will remain under house arrest during that time, with guards ensuring you cannot flee or communicate with potential co-conspirators." As guards moved to escort Serena from the chamber, she turned back to fix Lyra with a stare full of poison and frustrated rage. "This is not over, little queen. Crown or no crown, power or no power, you are still the same frightened servant girl who used to scrub my floors, and frightened little girls have a way of making fatal mistakes." The threat was clear, even delivered in formal council chambers before 24 witnesses. But Lyra was no longer the invisible servant who had learned to survive through silence and submission. She was a silver wolf who had killed 20 enhanced rogues without sustaining a single serious injury. "Perhaps," Lyra replied, her voice carrying the kind of quiet confidence that came from finally understanding her own power. "But I am no longer little, no longer frightened, and no longer yours to command. The scared girl died in this morning's attack. What stands before you now is your queen." The words rang with absolute conviction, echoing off stone walls that had heard centuries of leadership declarations. And for the first time since the ancient beast had changed everything with its impossible choice, Lyra truly believed them herself. The challenge circle had been prepared according to ancient tradition. carved into the earth at the sacred grove's heart, where the ancient beast had first recognized Lyra's true nature. Sacred stones marked the boundaries, their surfaces gleaming with symbols that had been old when the first packs claimed these territories. The entire pack gathered in concentric rings around the circle, their voices a low murmur of anticipation and dread, trial by combat, the most sacred and final form of pack justice, where truth was determined not by words or evidence, but by the absolute judgment of supernatural strength. The gods themselves were said to guide the outcome, ensuring that righteousness would always triumph over deception. Lyra stood at the circle's eastern edge, her silver hair catching the late afternoon sunlight as she performed the ritual preparations. She wore simple clothing that would not restrict movement during the shift, her feet bare against the earth that would soon be stained with blood. Around her neck hung the ancient amulet that Elder Moira had given her, a silver pendant carved with the royal seal of the Northern Territories. Across the circle, Serena completed her own preparations with the practiced efficiency of someone who had trained for combat since childhood. Her golden hair was braided back in an intricate warrior's knot, and her blue eyes held the cold focus of a predator preparing to kill. She had chosen trial by combat over truth-sensing, gambling that her years of formal training would overcome Lyra's raw power and newfound abilities. It was, Lyra reflected, exactly the kind of arrogant miscalculation she had come to expect from the beta female who had tormented her for years. Elder Marcus stood between them, his voice carrying clearly over the assembled pack as he recited the formal words that would bind them to combat. By ancient law and sacred tradition, the accused and the accuser meet in the circle of judgment. Let the gods witness this trial and guide the outcome according to divine justice. He raised an ancient ceremonial blade, its silver surface gleaming with runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The charges, conspiracy against pack leadership, attempted murder through poison and hired rogues, treason against the rightful order, the penalty for guilt, exile or death, as determined by the victor. Lyra felt her wolf stir restlessly beneath her skin, responding to the ritual energy that filled the grove like electricity before a storm. Her power, no longer bound by artificial constraints, hummed through her veins with an intensity that made the very air around her shimmer with heat. She could sense the pack's emotional state, could feel their anticipation and fear and desperate hope that justice would be served. Combat will continue until one participant yields, is rendered incapable of continuing, or dies, Marcus continued. Shifting is permitted and encouraged. No weapons save those provided by nature and bloodline. Let the trial begin. The blade descended, and Serena was already moving. The beta female shifted mid-leap, her human form dissolving into the golden-brown wolf that Lyra had seen countless times during pack runs and training exercises. She was beautiful in her animal form, sleek and powerful with the kind of predatory grace that spoke of excellent breeding and years of careful conditioning. Her leap carried her halfway across the circle in a single bound, claws extended and teeth bared in a snarl that would have sent most wolves fleeing in terror. But Lyra was not most wolves. Her own shift was smoother than silk, faster than lightning, the transition from human to wolf form so seamless it seemed like a trick of the light. Silver fur rippled across her skin as her bones reformed and her muscles expanded, as power that had been sleeping for 15 years finally found its full expression. When the transformation completed, the silver wolf that stood in the circle's centre was a creature of legend given flesh and fury. She was larger than Serena by a significant margin, her coat gleaming like starlight on snow, her eyes holding depths that seemed to contain the wisdom of ages. The royal bloodline sang in every line of her form, proclaiming her heritage to anyone with eyes to see. Serena's attack, which would have been devastating against any normal opponent, struck the silver wolf like a wave breaking against granite. Lyra absorbed the impact without yielding ground, her supernatural strength making Serena's desperate assault seem almost gentle by comparison. Then she struck back. The counterattack was precise, calculated, delivered with the kind of controlled violence that spoke of instincts bred into royal bloodlines over countless generations. Lyra's claws raked across Serena's flank, opening wounds that were deep enough to be painful but not immediately life-threatening, a warning delivered with surgical precision. Serena rolled away, blood matting her golden fur as she reassessed her opponent with eyes that now held the first flicker of real fear. She had expected to face the frightened servant girl she had terrorized for years, had gambled that raw power would be no match for trained technique. She was learning exactly how wrong that assumption had been. The beta female circled warily, looking for an opening that would allow her to use speed and agility to overcome the silver wolf's obvious advantages in size and strength. She feinted left, then right, testing Lyra's reactions and finding them frustratingly perfect. Royal blood carried more than just supernatural power. It carried the accumulated combat wisdom of generations of queens who had defended their territories with fang and claw. Serena's desperation was beginning to show. She launched herself forward in a series of rapid attacks, her claws seeking vital points with the precision of formal training. But each strike was countered, each assault turned aside by defensive movements that seemed to flow like water around stone. Lyra was not just defeating her. She was demonstrating the fundamental difference between learned technique and inherited mastery, between trained skill and royal birthright. Every movement proclaimed her superiority, not just as a fighter, but as a leader worthy of the crown she had never known she was born to wear. The pack was beginning to sense the inevitable outcome. Voices rose from the watching crowd, some calling encouragement to their future queen, others expressing amazement at the display of supernatural combat prowess they were witnessing. Serena heard them too, heard the shift in their loyalty, the growing acceptance of what the trial's outcome would mean for pack hierarchy and leadership structure. Her attacks became more frantic, more desperate, driven by the realization that she was not just fighting for her life, but for the future she had planned since childhood. It was that desperation that led to her first serious mistake. She overextended on a lunge aimed at Lyra's throat, committing too much weight to an attack that left her vulnerable if it missed its mark. The silver wolf stepped aside with fluid grace, allowing Serena's momentum to carry her past, then struck with devastating precision. Lyra's jaws clamped down on Serena's spine just below the skull, teeth designed by evolution and enhanced by royal blood finding the perfect grip to immobilize without killing. Serena's struggles ceased instantly, her body going limp as she realized the futility of fighting against a hold that could snap her neck with the slightest increase in pressure. The circle fell silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing and the distant rustle of wind through ancient trees. Lyra held her opponent pinned, demonstrating her absolute dominance while offering the mercy that separated true queens from mere tyrants. She could have killed Serena in that moment. Pack law would have supported it, justice would have demanded it, and no one would have questioned her right to eliminate a traitor who had orchestrated attacks on their territory. Instead, she released her grip and stepped back, shifting to human form with the same liquid grace that had marked her transformation to wolf. She stood naked and unashamed in the centre of the circle, silver hair flowing around her shoulders like a royal mantle, her voice carrying clearly to every member of the assembled pack. "I claim victory in this trial by combat," she announced, her words ringing with absolute authority. "The charges against Serena are proven by divine judgment. Her guilt is established beyond question." Serena shifted back to human form as well, her body marked with wounds that would heal but would always remind her of this moment. She knelt in the circle's centre, no longer the arrogant beta female who had terrorized servants and plotted against her betters. She was simply a defeated wolf, awaiting judgment from the queen she had tried to destroy. The penalty for treason is exile or death, Lyra continued, her gaze never leaving Serena's face. But mercy is the privilege of those who rule with wisdom rather than mere strength. She moved closer, her presence radiating the kind of power that made even the strongest wolves want to bow their heads in submission. You will leave this territory immediately and never return. You will carry word to any who might doubt it that the Northern Territories have a queen again, and that she deals justly with both enemies and friends. It was a sentence more generous than Serena deserved, and they both knew it. But it was also a demonstration of the kind of leadership the pack could expect from their newly revealed queen. Strength tempered by wisdom, justice balanced with mercy, power exercised in service rather than selfishness. Serena nodded once, accepting the judgment without protest. She had gambled everything on the trial's outcome and lost completely. All that remained was to leave with whatever dignity she could salvage from her spectacular defeat. As she walked from the circle, supported by pack members who would escort her to the territory's border, Lyra turned to face the assembled crowd. Hundreds of faces looked back at her, reflecting emotions ranging from awe to approval to the kind of reverence usually reserved for legends. "I am Lyra Blackthorn," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the grove. "Last daughter of the Northern Territories, chosen by the ancient beast, recognized by your Alpha King, proven in combat against those who would deny my birthright." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the pack like a blessing. "I claim the crown that is mine by blood, by power, and by divine recognition. I claim the right to rule beside Thane as your queen, to protect this pack and guide it toward a future worthy of our strength and honour." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Voices rose in acclamation, wolves howling their approval to the darkening sky, the ancient grove echoing with sounds of joy and relief and celebration. Thane stepped into the circle, magnificent in his formal ceremonial garb, his eyes holding pride and love and possessive satisfaction as he approached his mate. When he reached her, he knelt briefly in formal recognition of her proven status, then rose to claim her with a kiss that tasted of victory and destiny and promises that would last forever. "My queen," he said against her lips, the words carrying complete acceptance and unwavering support. "My king," she replied, finally understanding that she had always been exactly where she belonged.